The drone above my head clicked twice, then went silent, and that silence was worse than any sound it could have made. I was lying flat under a fallen pine, my breath slow, my heart pounding against the frozen ground. 3 days earlier, the sky had split open with light, and by evening, every major city on Earth had a new flag hanging over it. I did not see the flag go up over my city. I was already gone, moving into the tree line with a pack on my back and my daughter's hand in mine, following an order that was supposed to break us. The order was simple. Every surviving human was to leave the cities and enter the wilderness zones marked on their maps. No weapons of war, no gathering in large numbers, no return until called. They said it was for our safety, that the cities would be cleared of unstable structures and remaining resistance, and that the forests, deserts, and mountains were ours to wait in until they decided what came next. They called it a resettlement. We called it something else. I called it, in my own head, a chance. My name is Daniel Ferris. Before the invasion, I trained soldiers how to disappear in hostile land, how to move without leaving a mark, how to live off a forest for a month without anyone knowing you were there. I never imagined I would use that training against something that did not come from this planet, but when the order came, I did not feel fear the way I expected to. I felt something closer to readiness. The drone above me shifted, its rotors humming a different pitch, scanning heat instead of shape. I pressed my daughter's shoulder gently, and she went still, the way I had taught her, breathing through her nose, eyes closed, body flat against the frozen bed of pine needles. We had covered ourselves in a thin, reflective sheet, one of 100 small tricks that meant nothing to a soldier from Earth but everything against an eye built to hunt for warmth. It hovered for 11 seconds. I counted every one of them. Then it moved on, gliding low over the ridge, searching for people who were not supposed to know how to hide. That was the first lesson the invaders never learned about us. They expected broken people. They got hunters. We moved that night, deeper into the hills, joining a line of others who had scattered from the same town. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Nobody used a light. There were nurses in that line, teachers, a retired mechanic named Oliver who used to fix tractors, a young woman named Grace who had been a marathon runner, and now moved through the dark like she had done it her whole life. We were not an army. We were something the invaders had not accounted for, an entire species that had spent generations learning how to survive without power, without comfort, without permission. By the third week, their patrols began arriving less often. Their drones flew wider circles and found less and less. In the command reports I would later hear about, through channels I should not have had access to, the alien governors grew confused. Their models predicted a population in decline, weakening, desperate, ready to surrender for food and shelter. Instead, our numbers in the wilderness zones seemed to vanish from their sensors completely. Heat signatures dropped to near zero, radio signals stopped. It was as if the forests themselves had swallowed millions of people whole. They did not understand that when a person builds a fire in a ditch and covers it with green branches, the smoke disperses before it rises high enough to be seen. They did not understand that when a person layers cold weather clothing correctly, insulated with the right natural materials, a human body can hide its own warmth from any eye above. They did not understand rivers, or ridgelines, or how to read a forest the way an old woodsman reads a book. Grace found me on the 9th day, crouched near a stream, filtering water through cloth and charcoal. "They are lowering supply crates," she said, "near the old rail line, full of food, medicine, a radio." "They still think we are dying out here," I said. "Are we?" I looked at her, at the color still in her face, at the steadiness in her hands. "No," I said. "We are learning." We watched the crate drop from a distance, using an old spotting scope wrapped in dark cloth to kill any glare. A single hovering transport released it near a clearing, then rose and drifted away without landing. It sat there for 2 days, untouched, a silent test. On the 3rd day, 3 of our own went down to examine it, moving low along the tree line, checking for hidden sensors, cutting no direct path toward it. Oliver was one of them. He had spent 40 years reading engines and could read a strange machine almost as easily. Inside were rations, purified water tablets, blankets, and a small communication device meant to call for aid. It was, in their mind, an act of mercy. In ours, it was information. Oliver studied the device for hours before disabling its outbound signal and repurposing its receiver, turning their gift into our set of open ears. That was the second lesson they never learned. When you leave tools behind for people trained to survive with almost nothing, you are not showing mercy. You are handing over knowledge. Weeks passed like this, slow and careful, each day another small victory that meant nothing on its own but added up into something larger. We built underground shelters lined with old tarps and dug into hillsides where no heat could escape upward. We learned the patrol schedules of their drones by watching shadows and light patterns for hours at a time. We shared knowledge across groups through runners who moved only at night, memorizing messages instead of writing them down. The alien command, according to what I later heard from captured broadcasts, began sending small reconnaissance teams into the wilderness zones on foot, trying to understand why their sensors found nothing. Some of these teams did not return, not because we struck them down in some brutal way, but because the wilderness itself, guided quietly by human hands, made their own vehicles fail, their own supplies vanish, their own trails lead in circles, until they simply gave up and turned back confused, empty-handed, unable to explain what had happened to grids and instruments, in a place where nothing modern should have been able to interfere with them at all. I remember the first time I saw one of their patrols up close. It was near dusk, 6 of them moving in strange formation through a birch forest, their armor humming faintly, their eyes scanning with equipment far beyond anything we had. My daughter and I were 50 meters away, flat in a shallow trench covered with leaves and bark, breathing slow, watching them walk past without ever knowing we were there. They moved like they owned the ground beneath them, confident, mechanical, sure of their technology, but they moved loudly for a place like this. Twigs snapped under their boots. Their scanning devices whirred audibly in the quiet forest air. They had never learned to become part of a landscape, only to conquer it from above. When they were gone, my daughter whispered to me, "They are scared of the trees." "No," I said. "They just never needed to understand them before." That was the truth of it. Their power came from the sky, from ships and weapons and systems that could level a city in an afternoon. But none of that mattered once you took the sky away and left only ground, only shadow, only silence. The wilderness had never been their domain. It had always been ours, going back further than any war, further than any history we ever wrote down. Every human alive still carried some small memory of it in their blood, waiting to be called upon again. By the second month, entire regions considered compliant zones by the occupying force were reporting complete sensor blackout. Reports leaked to us, carried by sympathetic voices who had once worked in communication centers before the fall, described confusion turning into concern among the alien leadership. They had done this before, on other worlds, and it had always worked. Populations pushed into isolation weakened, fractured, and eventually surrendered outright, begging to be allowed back into cities under new rule. But we did not weaken. We adapted. Children who had never held a bow before learned to make simple ones from ash wood and sinew, not as weapons of harm, but as quiet tools for setting snares and gathering food without the noise of any device that could be tracked. Elders who remembered old ways of building fires without smoke, preserving meat without power, and reading weather without instruments, became the most valuable people in every group. Skills once thought forgotten returned, as if they had never truly left us, passed down through stories and half-remembered lessons, waiting only for the right moment to matter again. I began traveling between groups as a kind of quiet coordinator, carrying messages, teaching techniques, learning what worked and what did not. In one valley, I met a woman named Charlotte who had once been a park ranger, now leading nearly 200 people through terrain she knew better than any map. In another, I met a man named Nathaniel who had spent his life studying old survival methods as a hobby, now using that knowledge to keep an entire community fed and warm through a harsh winter with almost no modern tools at all. None of us called ourselves fighters. We called ourselves what we had always been, survivors, people who remembered how to live without permission from anything above us. The alien command's confusion grew into something closer to alarm. According to intercepted signals, their scientists could not explain how so many humans had vanished from every method of detection they possessed. Thermal scans found empty forests. Communication scans found silence. Movement sensors found nothing but wind and animals. It was as if the entire population marked for relocation had simply ceased to exist, and yet supply drops continued disappearing. Patrol routes continued reporting equipment failures, and their own soldiers returned from reconnaissance missions describing a wilderness that felt, in their words, deliberately alive against them. They began pulling back their patrols. Fewer drones flew over the deep forest regions. Fewer soldiers were sent walking beneath the trees. Whatever confidence they had brought down from orbit was fading the longer they tried to understand a world built on ground they refused to respect. It was during this time that Grace came to me with an idea that would change everything that followed. She had noticed a pattern in the supply drops, small variations in timing and location that suggested the alien command was trying something new, testing our reactions, watching for any sign of organized resistance forming beneath their notice. She believed they were preparing for something larger, perhaps a full withdrawal from certain regions, perhaps a change in strategy entirely. "If they are watching for a pattern," she said, then we should give them one they cannot understand. We began coordinating movement across dozens of separate groups, not to attack, not to confront, but simply to create the illusion of a population that was thriving, moving, adapting faster than anything their models predicted. Small signal fires appeared and disappeared within minutes. Trails were made and unmade overnight. Supply crates were emptied and left perfectly repacked with unfamiliar materials, a quiet message that said clearly, "We are not dying. We are learning your world as fast as you tried to learn ours." The effect on their command structure, based on later reports, was significant. Confusion turned into caution, and caution turned into hesitation. An occupying force built on control could not function against a population it could not locate, could not predict, and could not measure. Every method they used to conquer other worlds depended on visibility, on data, on knowing exactly where their subjects were and how weak they had become. We simply refused to be seen. By early spring, something remarkable began happening across the wilderness zones. Groups that had been isolated for months began finding each other, following old trail markers left by rangers decades before the invasion, rebuilding networks of movement that stretched across mountains and valleys alike. What began as scattered survival became something closer to a hidden civilization, thriving quietly beneath a sky that no longer seemed to notice us at all. I remember standing on a ridge overlooking a valley one clear morning, watching smoke rise faintly from a dozen hidden camps, all timed carefully to disperse before any drone passed overhead. My daughter stood beside me, taller now than she had been months before, her eyes steady in a way I had never seen before the invasion began. "Do you think they will ever find us?" she asked. "They already tried," I said. "They just never understood what they were looking for." It was true. They had expected fear. They had expected surrender. They had expected a species accustomed to comfort, to convenience, to systems and structures that made survival easy and dependence natural. What they found instead, hidden just beyond their reach, was something older than any of their technology could measure. A memory, buried deep within every person who had ever learned to build a fire, read a river, or trust the quiet language of the land beneath their feet. The wilderness was never meant to be our prison. It became our foundation. Reports continued to filter through captured channels describing growing unease among alien leadership. Some argued for renewed force, larger patrols, more advanced scanning equipment brought down from their ships. Others argued that continued failure only proved something dangerous about a species they had underestimated from the very beginning. Whatever conclusion they reached, one truth remained clear across every report we intercepted. They had ordered an entire population to disappear, expecting weakness and despair, and instead had lost track of them completely. We were not gone. We were simply no longer visible to eyes that had never learned how to see the land the way we did. Months turned into a season, then into the beginning of another, and the wilderness zones grew quieter to the outside world with every passing week, even as they grew louder with life beneath the surface. Children were born in hidden shelters lined with warm bark and dried moss. Communities shared knowledge freely, teaching skills that had almost been lost to comfort and convenience before the invasion forced us back into a relationship with the land that our ancestors had never fully abandoned. I often thought about the moment the order was given, the moment an alien voice broadcast across every surviving city demanding that we vanish into forests and mountains for our own protection. I wondered if they understood, even slightly, what they were truly asking a species like ours to do. Perhaps they believed isolation would break something essential in us, some dependency on cities and systems that no longer existed. Instead, they gave us back something we had almost forgotten we still carried within ourselves. The quiet confidence of knowing how to live without being seen, how to move without being tracked, how to survive without permission from any power above us. Near the end of that first year, I stood once more at the edge of a forest clearing, watching a soft mist settle over the trees as morning light broke through the canopy. Somewhere far above, beyond clouds that no longer worried us the way they once had, their ships continued to circle a world they thought they understood. They had ordered us to disappear, and we did exactly that. They simply never expected what would remain waiting for them in the silence that followed.